You were an Islamist.
Yes.
Aren't you a successful integration story, though?
Yes, but I'm an anomaly. I am an exception.
Luai Ahmed, a Yemeni content creator who was also a former refugee living in Sweden.
Second largest number of bombings of any country not officially at war, only after Mexico.
I felt like I had been removed from the Middle East and Yemen and placed in a hub for ISIS. Every holiday, you have airplanes going from Sweden back to Syria, Iraq. If Sweden starts stopping people from coming back to Sweden and actually questioning them, wait, you went back to Syria, you don't have a well-founded fear of persecution, then you're not a refugee. There is no multiculture in Sweden or Europe. There are parallel societies that are dysfunctional. Why are so many girls committing suicide in balkongflickor, which means balcony girls? And it's basically girls who are thrown off balconies because they've tainted the honor of the family. Deeply problematic social experiment that's not going to end well.
In Sweden, that
truck in Sweden.
The burning of the Quran has sparked 4 days of violence in a number of cities.
How are you going to be able to teach millions of Muslims that they should accept the Quran?
Last night he was in his apartment.
I would say the gravest mistake in Sweden's history. I saw how the Swedish government and the Swedish system was failing and betraying their own people, and I could no longer trust it. I thought to myself, if this is how you treat the Swedes who built this empire that we're all running to, how are you going to treat me in the future? But this conversation is not going to be had in Sweden until maybe 2030. And I'm so sick of waiting for the Swedes.
My name is Stefan Thompson. I'm the founder of Visegrad24, and today I am here with Luai Ahmed, a Yemeni content creator who was also a former refugee living in Sweden. Luai, great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Could you tell us the story of how you became a refugee in Sweden?
So I was a writer and a human rights activist in Yemen as a teenager. I went out in the Yemeni revolution during the Arab Spring to fight for women's rights and equality and all of that. One thing led to another. I was invited to come to Sweden to do a lecture about the revolution as a young revolutionary Yemenite. And upon going there, my family had told me not to come back and seek asylum. And at first I didn't want to do it because why would I move to Sweden when I want to change my country, Yemen? And then I thought about it and went back to my room and remembered that I was homosexual, or am homosexual, and remembered that there is a death penalty in Yemeni on my neck. And I would not be able to be vocal and loud and say everything that I feel and do everything that I want to do in Yemen. So I took the opportunity and I moved to Sweden and I sought asylum there and became a refugee.
So Sweden is an interesting place because it has been a safe harbor for many people. And from the Yugoslav wars, when it brought in a large number of refugees from former Yugoslav countries, all the way up to the Arab Spring, there's been about 10% of the country is formed of people who have sought asylum in Sweden. And yet the country is transformed drastically from safe haven with one of the highest security rates in Europe, one of the lowest sexual crimes rates in the world, to now becoming something very different. And I wanted you to tell me about, having lived there, you've witnessed some of that transformation. Could you tell us about it?
Absolutely. Sweden has done one of the gravest mistakes, I would say the gravest mistake in Sweden's history, which is they thought that they were rescuing refugees who were fleeing war and who were fleeing to find freedom and security. But what they did was they saved many refugees who did flee away from oppression and tyranny, but they also saved the terrorists and the extremists who are suffocating this freedom. When I first arrived in Sweden, I arrived at a refugee camp in Halmstad. And in this very refugee camp, I felt like I had been removed from the Middle East and Yemen and replaced and placed in a hub for ISIS. In 2015, when I was still at this refugee camp and the Charlie Hebdo attack happened, my roommates and the people at the refugee camp were out and celebrating, and they made cake and they were celebrating terrorism, basically. And I remember thinking to myself in Sweden, wait, I thought Sweden was saving us refugees, but here I am in a refugee camp with more than 60 people, and the vast majority of the refugees who were in this refugee camp were terrorist sympathizers.
Why do you think these people weren't? Why do you think these people had come to Sweden if they were celebrating the Charlie Hebdo massacre? Why had these people not remained in majority Muslim countries where they can live their Islamism? Why bring it to Sweden?
There are a plethora of reasons. There's a push and pull factor. The push was Middle East is not a safe place for anyone really, but most specifically women, Jews, gay people, Christians. And so if it's not a safe hub for all of these people, it's not a safe hub for the Muslims either, and they also want to leave. Most people in the Middle East and most Muslims living in the Middle East who are religious or non-religious want to leave, so that's why they leave. Why they go to Sweden is because Sweden has the strongest pull factor. In Sweden, you don't have to learn the language or know anything about society or contribute or pay in the economy for you to become a citizen. So one of the main lines of discussions in the refugee camps was, we hate Sweden, it's too cold, it's too dark, the people are too racist, the women are sluts, but they give you the highest amount of money for social compensation in case you don't work. If you have a lot of children, then they give you more money than Switzerland and Germany. And the number one thing was, if you live here for 4 years or 5 years, you become a citizen without having to learn the language. So a lot of people felt like Sweden was hugging them and attracting them there, which they were. You have prime ministers and politicians who are saying, Sweden has no culture. All the great culture that we have in Sweden has come from outside, and our culture is barbarian. If you have leaders of political parties who say this thing, it shows a strong sense of oikophobia, a hatred of their own culture, and a love for other cultures, which also has another name, which is masochistic nationalism. The multiculturalists and the leftists in Sweden and Europe, they believe that they're multiculturalists, but there is no multiculture in Sweden or Europe. There are parallel societies that are dysfunctional. What these people are masochistic nationalists, which is kind of like they are nationalists, but of other cultures that they have absolutely no idea about. So you have far leftists who speak greatly about other cultures in the Middle East and people who come from other countries where they wouldn't be able to survive in these countries and in these constitutions for 1 minute. But it is a part of this Western Marxist oikophobia of we love everything else and we hate ourselves that has really laid the groundwork for the migration policies that we have seen in Europe and most specifically in Sweden.
Isn't a solid counter-argument to what you're saying about failed migration policies is your own story of you go from being an Islamist to being someone who is now fighting to defend what Western Europe once was? Aren't you a successful integration story, though?
Yes, but I'm an anomaly. I am an exception. I'm not just me. There are thousands, if not tens of thousands of Middle Easterners who fled the oppression. Real refugees, they do exist. And I am one of those people who fled a law that wanted my blood just for simply existing. So there are plenty of refugees that do need the help, that do need to be rescued from the Middle East and from these authoritarian regimes. But what Sweden has done is it's opened its borders for everybody to come.
So how would you sift between someone like you, who was worthy of asylum, and someone who, in your opinion, isn't?
That is a question that you need to ask the politicians in Europe, not me. But I would say, as it is right now, there is no sifting process.
At all?
At all. In Sweden.
So what were the questions what were the questions that were asked of you when you sought asylum in Sweden? What was the process like for you?
So it's actually quite entertaining to me because you have a 3-hour session, or it could be 4 or 5, where you're interrogated and you have to answer questions. Why did you flee? What would happen to you if you go back home? Who are you? What are the reasons for your founded fear of persecution? And after this 3 or 4 hour process, you wait for a few months and you get your decision. But the problem is, when I was at the refugee camp, roommates in my area, in my refugee camp, would sit down and literally have conversations with each other. One person would act like the interviewee and one person would act like the interviewer, and they would practice their lies. They would practice the fake stories that they had come up with in order to be able to be accepted by the country. I do think that right now it is too late to have these conversations. How is Sweden going to be able to sift out the terrorists from the actual refugees? That's such an irrelevant question right now.
So what is the relevant question?
The relevant question is that Sweden since 1995 has taken in more than 2.5 million people with absolutely no sifting or no understanding of these cultures, of the motives of where people have come from, and the vast majority of the people have become citizens. You have people who are Swedish citizens without being able to murmur a single Swedish word. You have gangs that are Swedish citizens who hate Sweden, hate Swedish people, rape women, attack normal people who walk on the streets. And those people are considered Swedish citizens that you can't take away their citizenships from. So the main issue right now in Sweden is internal. The Swedish politicians today have completely changed from the past 4 or 6 years ago. 6 years ago, when I started engaging in Swedish politics, if you mentioned the word Islam or Islamism, you were considered a fascist, Nazi, right-wing extremist. Today, we have political leaders in the center, the Social Democrats, who say more controversial things than I said like 4 or 5 years ago. I never said things like, we don't want Somali towns in our country, which is something that
Is that something that you consider radical?
To say that we don't want Somali towns in our town. I don't consider that to be radical, but to the Swedes, it is. 4 or 5 years ago, it was not just radical, it was Nazi and far right and racist. So we see a shift in the policies, and we see a shift in the mindset of the Swedes and Swedish politicians, which is, to me, very little and very too late. Because what we see on the streets in Sweden right now is Sweden does not exist in Stockholm. If you take the train from the center of Sweden and you go to Rinkeby, which would take you like 10 minutes.
I've been there. I've interviewed people in Rinkeby. We put away our camera equipment and left. We actually never took it out of the bag, to be entirely honest with you. The insecurity was just too big.
It's absolutely horrifying. I do remember when I was in Malmö at university, I was going to a party in Rosengård, which is kind of like Malmö's Rinkeby, and I had a friend there who was blonde, blue-eyed, and he was supposed to come to the party. Once he found out, I told him, come to the party. He's like, yeah, sure. He asked me where. I was like, oh, it's in this area in Rosengård. He told me, no, I can't go. And I told him, why can't you go? And he said, look at me. I'm blonde and blue-eyed. I would get beaten on the street. And I remember in that moment thinking, wait, what the? You're a Swede. This is supposed to be your country, not mine. And I've had many moments such as that made me realize that the Swedish country is no longer a Swedish country. Another example was when I was in Malmö University, I decided to leave the student house and find just a room. I ended up living with a Swedish woman who was a pensioner, who would wake up at 6 a.m. in the morning to go work, even though she was supposed to be retired and just resting. And all because she couldn't make ends meet, and she had to wake up early in the morning, and because she had a lot of children and didn't pay enough taxes to be able to get a good pension. She was getting nothing from the government. I, a Yemenite who has nothing to do with Sweden, who had just moved to Sweden, I was going to university and I was getting money from the government in order to be able to go to the university, and I was getting more money than she did, even though she's Swedish. Her ancestors are Swedish. Her bloodline and her history is what built this great country. Meanwhile, I just took a plane from Sana'a to this country, to Sweden, and was getting all of these silver plates from the government, while I was seeing my roommate, who built this country, get nothing and
go to work as an old lady.
And go to work as an old lady,
sure,
just because she did not pay enough taxes. And to me, I saw how the Swedish government and the Swedish system was failing and betraying their own people, and I could no longer trust it. I thought to myself, if this is how you treat the Swedes who built this empire that we're all running to, how are you going to treat me in the future? You don't know what justice or morality is. And I became entirely skeptic of the Swedish system and governance and the Swedish politicians and journalists.
If you were given absolute power in Sweden tomorrow, what would you do?
I think the first thing I would do, and I think this is something I've written a controversial column about. I think one of the main a main solution to the migration crisis that is happening, or the refugee crisis, if you will, in Sweden, one thing that the Swedish government can do that would actually solve a lot of issues is a law that says, well, actually, they don't have to come up with a law because there is already a law, but because it's racist, they don't apply it. But this law is actually real, and it's a UN law that is supposed to be practiced by the Swedish law, but because the Swedes find it to be too racist, they don't follow it. And this law, which is mandated by the Alien Convention with the United Nations, is if you're a refugee and you gain status to stay in a new country, if you go back to your home country, you're not allowed to go back to Sweden or whatever you became a resident. Which makes sense because...
Which means that you are a refugee, you've arrived in Sweden, but then you go and have a holiday in Kabul, for example. So you go back for some major Muslim holiday, you go back for Ramadan, say, and then you've spent some time with your family, and then you come back to be a refugee again in Sweden. This is essentially the UN prohibits you from doing that, but it's not being applied.
By Sweden, yes. And I think so if Sweden starts stopping people from coming back to Sweden and actually questioning them, wait, you went back to Syria, you don't have a well-founded fear of persecution, then you're not a refugee. Therefore, you cannot stay in our country because you have literally broken the law. Now, I, as a real Yemeni refugee, I cannot go back to Yemen because I am a real refugee. I have a well-founded fear of persecution. If I go back to Yemen, I could either be killed for being homosexual or for criticizing Islamism or for saying that Israel should exist. So I do have a well-founded fear of persecution, and therefore I can't go back to Yemen. Now, every summer, every year, every winter, every holiday, you have airplanes going from Sweden back to Syria, Iraq, all the countries that the refugees came from, and they keep going back and vacationing where they came from. They are breaking the refugee law. Now, if Sweden actually follows the UN Convention and does not let them go back in, you'd have huge numbers of refugees or not real refugees, unable to go back to Sweden.
So you have a method to sift through what you would refer to as fake refugees.
Yes, and in the newspaper that we worked in, in the newspaper bulletin that I worked in, we did a huge research asking immigrants and refugees if they go back to their home countries, and it showed that 8 out of 10 of refugees actually do go back to their home countries. So what would happen here if you actually apply this law is either 80% of the refugees would go back to their countries and be unable to come back to Sweden because they're obviously lying about being real refugees because they don't have a fear in their home countries. The second thing is that it would recalibrate their loyalty. If you're unable to go back to a certain country, you would know that, okay, Sweden is where I will live for the rest of my life, and therefore I have to contribute to this country. I have to learn the language because I can go back to Somalia or Afghanistan or Kabul. So there would be a shift in the conversation of what a refugee is. But this conversation is not going to be had in Sweden until maybe 2030. And I'm so sick of waiting for the Swedes. But this is just one thing that I would do, one law that you could actually apply that would help a lot of identity issues in Sweden for the refugees.
Do you feel Swedish in any way, shape, or form?
I do feel very Swedish. I feel Swedish because after I've assimilated perfectly, I correct my Swedes Swedish. They make a lot of grammatical mistakes that I correct. And I feel like the language has helped me understand Sweden from an exterior point of view that made my Swedish identity very strong. So, and I also feel very Swedish when I leave Sweden because socially speaking, I've become more of a mummy, which is very Swedish. As a Swede, you're supposed to just sit still as a mummy and not talk, not have eye contact with anybody, just mind your own business. And I've become that. And so in that way, I do feel Swedish culturally, but I do also think the idea of Swedish is something that is so deep and needs to be dissected. You don't just ask someone, are you Swedish or are you... There are three dimensions. There are Swedish citizens. I'm a Swedish citizen. There is ethnic Swedes, like Swedes who are born and molded and have lived there for generations, and those are real and they exist. And then you have the cultural Swedes, which could be like myself. I have culturally become more Swedish. Then you have people who are either citizens or ethnic Swedes or cultural Swedes. You have people who are all three. It's very complicated. There's more nuance to what a Swede is. But the issue in Sweden before 2009, 2020 was the ethnic Swedes was very taboo to talk about because everybody was a Swede. Initially, as soon as you arrive in Sweden, so the people who were celebrating the Charlie Hebdo attack in the refugee camp that I lived in were also Swedes because they moved to Sweden. And this understanding of Swedishness is also one of the main things that have changed Sweden to the dangerous country that it is today. Because people did not understand that, no, you don't just move to Sweden and become Swedish. There's a culture, there's a language, there are values, and all of these things have to be adapted. And what Sweden did was hand out the citizenships to basically everybody, whether they adapted to the culture or not, whether they wanted to be in Sweden or not. And what happened is you actually created an enemy of the state within the country. And Sweden is now dealing with the issues. We see how when somebody goes out and burns the Quran, which is just a part of freedom of speech, and you should not, as a religious person, whether you're Muslim or Christian or Jewish, you should not attack or stop someone from burning a book if they bought it. And in Sweden, when someone burns the Quran, you have hundreds of people going out and actually trying to kill the police and trying to kill people because they feel like their religion is more important than the country and the state. And this is also...
Do you think that burning the Quran as a form of protest is a useful or productive form of protest? To clarify, I understand that if you want to have freedom of speech, you have to be able to make people uncomfortable. But do you think you are a former Muslim, do you think it is a useful form of protest?
Well, I am a former religious Muslim. I don't consider myself a religious Muslim. I do pray sometimes if I find a nice mosque, and I do read the Quran from time to time. So I am attached to Islam in ways, but I view it from a very critical point of view. I don't just read the Quran at point blank and believe that it's God's word, God's words. In Sweden, you'd have many people who tell you, I'm a Christian. And then you're like, when was the last time you read the Bible? Like, I never read the Bible. But with Islam and the Muslim community, if you're a Muslim and you don't read the Quran, you don't follow the law, you drink alcohol, you're gay, or anything that does not fall in line with what the imams and the majority of the country says, then you're kafir and you should be killed. And this is an issue. So the problem is within the Islamic society as well. I have friends who are Sufis who believe in a certain sect in Islam, and they're not considered Muslims according to the vast majority of the Islamic culture. And the issue is not with the Sufis or the reformist Muslims. The issue is with the Islamic community itself and the mosques that teach people to become religious fanatics that kill anything that is not reflective of what is considered to be the main or real Islam. I do believe that burning the Quran is stupid. If you want to criticize a religion, if you want to criticize an idea, do it with your mind. Write about it. Make videos. Do research. Prove it. If you burn it, then you're just showing anger, you're showing frustration, you're showing hatred sometimes. It could be hatred. But there are women, for example, who burn the Quran because they had been oppressed their entire lives by Islamic extremism. And there are people who shred the Quran in front of embassies to say, I grew up in this culture and this culture has oppressed me, this book has oppressed me. So you should never rule out people's self-expression, especially in Europe where you've arrived to a point where religion does not play a major role in society, and you should just keep it to yourself. I do think that the people who do burn the Quran, many of them are doing it out of hatred towards Muslims, but there are people who do it because they want to show what would happen. I mean, the writers and journalists who are critical of the migration have been saying for the past 20, 30 years, this is not going to end well. You're bringing in a lot of people who do not believe in the same values that we believe in. This is a deeply problematic social experiment that's not going to end well. So many people, some people who go out and burn the Quran are just trying to say, look, I'm just showing you what we have been telling you for the past 20, 30 years, that the social experiment, the so-called multicultural utopia of Europe is not real, and we have conflicting values at hand in our culture, in our country, that are impossible to deal with. How are you going to be able to teach millions of Muslims that they should accept the burning of the Quran?
What do you think lies at the end of the multiculturalism journey?
A recognition of its failure. You can't have, I usually say this in Sweden, you want to have multiculturalism, great, I love multiculturalism. I'm a Yemeni, and a big part of my Yemeni culture is child marriage. So how about you allow me to marry a child in Yemen, like a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old? And usually the Swedes get shocked at this and get angry. What the fuck? Are you a pedophile? I'm like, no. Of course, I don't believe in early marriage. My mom has been fighting early marriage in her entire life. I'm just trying to show them how ridiculous their idea of multiculturalism is. There are cultures that are not aligned or adapt to Swedish law, and therefore you cannot have an idea of multiculturalism where any culture or any different cultures can come to Sweden and coexist. They're not going to coexist, they're going to live in parallel to the mainstream culture, and they're going to offer a lot of problems. There's this common and famous phenomenon in Sweden called balkongflickor, which means balcony girls. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, barely anybody spoke about this phenomenon. Today, it's more common to speak about it. And it's basically girls who are thrown off balconies. And before, people would wonder, why are so many girls like committing suicide in Sweden? Is it the lack of vitamin D? Are they just depressed because they hate Sweden? The real answer is their fathers or sisters or someone from their family or their husbands throw them off the balcony because they've tainted the honor of the family. Now, if I were to go back to Yemen and the state does not kill me for some reason, the Houthis give me a pardon for some reason, I would most probably be killed by a family member or a friend, because there's such a strong tribalistic nature to a society like Yemen, where the people take the law to their hand and don't wait for the government, because people don't trust the states, especially because our states are dysfunctional. So in Yemen, you would get killed. You probably wouldn't get thrown off a balcony. You'll just get shot and buried. In Sweden and Europe, what happens is that the families start killing their own daughters and their gay children and their children who drink alcohol, and people who just go against whatever Islam and Islamic theology is.
You were an Islamist, and now you're not.
Yes.
Do you think that there is any hope for the Middle East and for transforming the Middle East and for a lasting peace to come to the region?
Absolutely. I mean, look at the UAE and Saudi Arabia. I mean, 10 years ago, I wrote tirades and rants and articles about how Saudi Arabia and the UAE were responsible for the destruction in the Middle East, responsible for the radicalization. They introduced many of the dogmatic practices that we have in the Middle East, like the niqab that hides women from head to toe. We didn't have that in Yemen before Saudi Arabia decided that that was a cool product to fight the Iranians, and now we have it. So they took their oil and decided to open up and become more international, to, cozy up with the West, while countries like Yemen and Somalia are completely detached from the oil and from the cultural revolution that's happening in the Middle East. So I'm not a big fan of what Saudi Arabia and the UAE have done in the past, but I am a big fan of what they are doing right now. I'll give you an example. In Sweden right now, if you have an imam who goes out and preaches misogyny and anti-Semitism and violence, they're undetected. They're in mosques and basements and nobody knows anything about them, and all Muslims go and listen to them. In Saudi Arabia, all the mosques are monitored, and at the site and at the width of any extremism or violence, they get thrown in jail. And many of the extremist imams in Saudi Arabia are in jail right now. Same thing in the UAE. They deliver scripts to mosques every Friday for them to read. So nothing extremist, nothing anti-West, nothing anti-America. focus on prosperity, coexistence, love, and how beautiful Islam is. So we need that in Yemen, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Somalia, in Afghanistan. And we're not going to be able to do it on our own. Yemen and Afghanistan and Middle Eastern countries that are radical need the help of the West and Israel and Saudi Arabia and the UAE in order to apply these very strong and amazing laws, because that's the only way you're going to be able to cut Islamism and hatred from its roots. It's by re-educating the children. I mean, the reason that I believed in death penalties and I believed in the eradication of Israel and that Jews were evil maniacs who were genocidal and need to be killed, it's by the mosques. I was a child in my local mosque and my imam kept preaching about it and I absorbed all of it. Because when you're a child, you're just looking for God. You're trying to find answers to life. And you have this imam who knows God, who's closest to God, who's read most about God, and he tells you that God is fear, God is violence, God is hatred, God is the eradication of Israel and Jews. So of course, as a child, I took all of this and it became a part of my identity and who I was until I moved to Sweden and started realizing, oh wait, Jews are normal human beings. Oh wait, Islam is not a perfect ideology to run a country. Oh wait. So it took for me like the realization of experiencing a country that is based off democracy and newly founded understanding of human life and social issues. While children in Gaza and Yemen and Afghanistan and Somalia do not have the privilege that I had, which is moving to Sweden, and they don't have the privilege of finding other alternatives for information, because the only information you have is the mosque, where they literally read medieval 7th century texts and try to decipher them instead of like trying to decipher the future and current affairs.
Luai Ahmed, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Stefan, thank you so much for having me.